Hi there. My name is Susanne Katus. I'm VP of Brand and Business Development for Datamaran. And today I'm thrilled to have an opportunity to speak with Yoko Dochi, who is Managing Director and Global Head of Investor Relations at Softbank Group. Hi, Yoko.
Hi.
As well as Ioannis Ioannou, who's a professor of strategy and entrepreneurship at London Business School, as well as a globally recognized advisor and influencer. Thanks for joining us, Ioannis.
Thanks for having me.
So we're here because London Business School is a Datamaran academic partner. And this past year, senior executives, including Yoko, participated in Ioannis's senior executive course called Sustainability, Leadership, and Corporate Responsibility. As part of this course, the executives received free access to Datamaran's certification program and our software analytics platform. And this was really to enhance learning on external and ESG risks, as well as opportunities, with the power of Datamaran's patented technology. Today, we're going to dive into an important question of how can business executives really identify and focus on the external and ESG risks that matter most for their companies, and do that in a way that's credible, defensible, forward-looking, and really builds trust with key stakeholders, including investors. So Yoko, starting with you, many CEOs and CFOs are really starting to take a bigger and more public stance on ESG related risks, from climate change to diversity and inclusion. We're also starting to see that investors are placing much more scrutiny on what companies themselves are saying publicly, including what they're including within their public disclosures and annual reports, essentially trying to better understand if companies are being authentic in their commitment to these issues and if they're actually integrating these issues into their core business strategy. From your perspective, what processes do companies need to have in place in order to meet these rising expectations from investors as well as regulators?
Okay, thanks for that question. I think it is very, very important, first of all, for that company's board, CEO and the chairman and leadership team owns the whole process. Owns that ESG sustainability integration is a key factor for the company's long-term survival and success. And often investors might be wondering whether the company's saying is actually the real. And one way to look at it is really in the public domain. Yes, the companies now file annual reports, in many cases integrated annual reports. And in those public space, whether the company really take the proactive decisions as to define what is the real materiality is for this company. Not just following somebody's framework, but just to sort of really make sure that the materiality that company thinks is really linked and connected with a corporate vision, business strategy, what the company think what this is. And then that is, translated into the business plan. And the way that, external stakeholders, including investors, can actually monitor that the company's actions really following that.
Absolutely. It brings up a great point. And Ioannis, I know this is an area that you research heavily for many years now. What role do you see technology playing in supporting these processes?
Absolutely. So I think Yoko did a fantastic job explaining to us how the integration can happen both internally as well as externally. It's very important to understand that the foundation of integrating sustainability or ESG into corporate strategy, into business models is the foundation is this intangible assets, is the relationships that you build with your stakeholders. And unlike how some companies think, these relationships and these assets do not materialize out of thin air. They need time, they need effort, they need commitment, and therefore, like every other asset, they need the necessary investments in order to establish them for the long term. So that's one key parameter that we should keep in mind here. Technology is a very important factor when it comes to the integration of ESG for multiple reasons, especially when we start talking about new technologies like AI, big data, machine learning, and so on. And let me explore some of those dimensions with you. First of all, we know that there's a lot of waste in the system, and therefore technologists can come in and really take the level of efficiency that companies can achieve, whether we're talking about water management, waste management, energy management, transportation systems, and so on and so forth. So a lot of slack that can be picked up, a lot of waste that can be picked up through these systems. Second of all, technologies might quite literally allow us to do things that the human mind cannot do on its own. For instance, we know that when we talk about climate change, for instance, right? We talk about complex issues. We talk about complex systems, like how do we translate climate change into weather patterns? Think about it. If you are an insurance company that sells flood insurance, obviously you would want to understand not only climate change over the long term, but also weather patterns so that you know where flooding is more or less likely to take place. All of those issues should be addressed by technology. The third factor, of course, is in terms of transparency and accountability of companies. We know that in terms of transparency, exactly, companies like Datamaran allow us to more deeply analyze the data, the reports, the information that the companies are putting out there. As Yoko rightly pointed out, not just to analyze them, right, but really dig deep and understand how serious are they really? What's the materiality? In other words, how do they perceive the salience of these issues for the core of their business model, of their operations? And in fact, how do they perceive these issues in terms of the value that they are creating, both in financial terms as well as social terms? And I'm also very, very excited, in addition to the transparency and accountability aspect towards all stakeholders, including investors. I'm very excited by the possibility of these new technologies like blockchain, for instance, that really hold the potential to bring a whole different level of accountability, especially when we talk about tracing issues throughout long, complex, and deep supply chains.
Absolutely. Yeah, you brought up some important points there about efficiency, but also about accuracy of information, just given the scope of information that we can consume now through technology. And a point there about salience. And Yoko, that connects very much to something that you said earlier in terms of, you need to ensure that the company takes ownership of these issues and understands through a data-driven materiality process, really what are the most important issues. Mm-hmm. When it comes to defining materiality or material issues for a company, it seems there's a bit of a disconnect between what companies themselves define as material and what investors may think is material for companies. There are various reasons that we can point to, ESG ratings and rankings, for instance, the lack of one single standard, which will we ever reach that, to be questioned. So thinking about this concept of materiality, how does a data-driven approach to materiality really help corporate leaders in finding a common ground with these types of stakeholders?
It will be very helpful because, if you think about the internal process of defining what are those issues which are really material to this company, company does that sort of soul searching internally, which means, that reflects the company's sort of DNA or the value set, but also really what business we are in. What is this company's business model? What is our, perceived business environment, how this is going to evolve. Therefore, where we see opportunities and risks and what it means for us to then, survive and thrive. But then this is, in a way, rather sort of business-centric approach and also internal approach. But then for this to become really, how do you say, effective, meaningful set of materialities, for the company to really develop meaningful metrics in order to make the dialogue with investors or other stakeholders possible. For that process, we would very much benefit from information, data, which really tell us what are those expectations that these individual stakeholders of this company have, whether that's customers, whether that is suppliers, whether that's business partners, internal employees even, yes? So, how they see the critical issues for this company, that actually sort of help the company to really integrate sort of outside, partially, views into this process to make it more meaningful. And by doing that, there is I also feel during the investor relations that there is a kind of gap between what company thinks this is, our priorities for the, sustainability efforts, and what investors are looking at and evaluating us. Investors seem to sort of have a tendency to adopt, standardized formula. Looking at this company by industry. In some cases, it's Japanese companies are just Japan Inc. It's one category. Yes. So businesses' own unique features, not necessarily deeply embedded in that expectation sets. So, this makes slightly sort of this misaligned relationship between the company and the investment community, as I see.
Absolutely. And Ioannis, I'm wondering if you want to elaborate a bit on that, in terms of the role that data is playing to help overcome some of that misalignment and what you think is currently driving that disconnect.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it goes with, there's no doubt that the whole sort of space of reporting and transparency on non-financial issues is on a very fast, but for sometimes, for some people, it can be a very confusing trajectory. We often hear about the alphabet soup of different acronyms, as you mentioned earlier, different reporting standards, different guidelines, and so on. Now, I understand that when you are in the midst of all that, it can seem extremely frustrating, right? If you're a company, you ask, well, which one should I use? How do I report? And if you're an investor, you see all of these frameworks and you say, well, what is compatible here? How can I actually build a portfolio by using this information if this information is perhaps not so compatible across companies? So, but it's important to keep in mind, though, that muddy and messy as it seems right now, the whole space is certainly moving in the right direction with very fast, as a matter of fact. And I'm optimistic that at some point very soon, we will be talking about a global or international standard about sustainability reporting. Now, while we do that, right, while on the way to a standard, I think a data-driven approach is absolutely essential. And let me elaborate a bit about why that's the case. First of all, internally, when you are going, if you're a company that's started to use non-financial metrics for instance, executive compensation or incentives within the organization, and you want to be a responsible company, an ESG conscious company, well, you better make sure that you use the right ESG data to incentivize your top leadership, to incentivize the employees within your organization. Second of all, if you're really truly committed to your stakeholders, you need that kind of a data-driven approach in order to create accountability, in order to measure and monitor the development of these relationships, and therefore to measure and monitor the development of these intangible assets that we talked about earlier. And third of all is the external world. First of all, society at large, that many companies feel the need, increasingly so, to report about their non-financial performance. That's why we have seen the explosion of ESG or sustainability reports in recent years. And as Yoko rightly pointed out, investors are a critical stakeholder that requires a data-driven approach because it allows them to have data that is comparable, that is accurate. And in fact, let's be honest, right? Greenwashing is rampant out there. There's many companies that want you to think that, they're the next best thing to Greenpeace, but actually might not have changed much in terms of business as usual. So I do believe that a lot of these technologies that we have in the reporting space, perhaps through triangulation, perhaps through looking at patterns over time, perhaps through a more deeper and algorithmic, perhaps, understanding of these reports, again, a set of reports that the human mind alone cannot process, but an algorithm can help us find, for instance, inconsistencies over time within a report, errors, something that looks exaggerated, something that doesn't fit a pattern, for instance, right? All of those are valuable information, of course, for investors specifically that, especially those that try to pick companies that are going to be around in 20, 30, 50 years down the line, think pension funds, for instance, but also in terms of cultivating, as I mentioned earlier, these stakeholder relationships and generating these intangible assets.
Mm.
Absolutely. And data speaks the language of all of these stakeholders. Importantly, Yoko, as you mentioned, senior executives within companies, as well as the board. So it's also a way to I think, overcome the education that's currently required within a lot of companies in understanding the value of taking ownership of these types of risks and opportunities. At least that's something we see with the companies that we work with.
Mm.
Great. And we've been talking about technology and we've been talking about data and through our academic program and the course at LBS, you had access to Datamaran to support your learning and your research. Curious, and we'll start with Ioannis and then we'll conclude with Yoko. What do you see as the biggest benefit for companies here?
So, I mean, I could talk for another hour about the benefits, Susan, but I'll try to keep it short for now. As you might have guessed from the answers that I've already given you, I do think that, and of course, as an academic, right, a data-driven, evidence-based approach is at the center of what we do. And we need to be very clear because this is a space where, talking about the sustainability and ESG space, there's a lot of fluff out there. Right, there's absolutely a lot of fluff. So I think that to your earlier point about education, it is absolutely critical within organizations, at the very least, to build up, to agree on the same language, because sustainability might mean one thing for one person, might mean something for another. ESG is the same, and so on. So before we even go outside the organization, it's critical to develop that common ground, that common language. And I think that the education itself, but also this alignment on the metrics that we use and to monitor. And you know what? I mean, how could you not achieve that alignment? For instance, clearly you're going to need your employee input if you're going to decide on metrics on how to incentivize, motivate, reward them, or give them their bonuses every year. It's the same thing with your C-suite. How could you possibly arrive at a compensation package if the metrics are not solid and if you both, or meaning both parties, do not really understand what the metrics are actually capturing? Because you're using them because you want to incentivize the top leadership, you want to incentivize the employees in order towards a certain behavior, in this case, a socially responsible behavior, right? So the language of metrics internally allows you to achieve that, what I would call strategic coherence throughout the organization. And of course, externally, I think that a data-driven approach allows companies to more robustly and perhaps more convincingly articulate their sustainability story, articulate their ESG story, right? I think long gone are the days when we were reading all of these sustainability reports, and I'm sure that both of you have seen it, right? These flashy pictures, glossy paper, and all this wonderful novel-like writing. There's nothing wrong with writing novels, of course, but if we're going to talk about communicating a company's value creating potential and value creating model, it is absolutely fundamental to be able to integrate its financial and non-financial objectives and metrics in communicating that story. That's why we see so many companies more proactively educating their investors about precisely that integration between ESG and financial metrics at the core of their business. So in order to be able to do that with more convincingly and without the fluff that we talked about earlier, it's absolutely important again to have that data-driven approach. I say, so the short answer to your question is that the benefits are internal in terms of strategic coherence, but also external in terms of validity and effectiveness of what you're trying to communicate.
Thank you.
Yes. And if I may just add on that, data can help the process at the corporation, quite extensively. And I'm just thinking about a few things. One is, within the company, this is a company's processing where the data can, make a big impact, particularly big data, taken from all, range of stakeholders for the company. What I'm talking about here is that, often the sustainability department is a part of business planning division or general administration department. They're not the same as investor relations department, for instance. However, it is primarily today, investor relations department, which handles the communication on the ESG and sustainability matters. Because in a way, investors are the leading, stakeholder group in this area. But then, this kind of creates the disparity within the company, that the information out there, what investors are saying, what other stakeholders are saying, not necessarily directly going into the sustainability headquarters of the company. So the data platform can actually enable these internal, parties involved in the sustainability communication, sustainability practice, to have an access to all this wholesome stakeholder expectations, concerns, informations on one platform, one single platform. That will actually help the internal process significantly by making it streamlined, by making it faster, everybody on the same page. And that will help the company, I hope, to better articulate, develop the languages indeed, to then be shared with, outside stakeholder community, including the investors. I think it's massively beneficial, as was the case I learned from Datamaran, but, on an ongoing, timely, and holistic way, where, who, which stakeholder is talking what, and, showing concerns, showing interests, taking certain actions towards this company. This really helps, monitoring what are the ongoing risks, what are the ongoing, potential opportunities, where we need to reach out in order to develop this, foundation of trust, and then in turn, sort of reflect that into our own company process to reflect the sustainability element into our, actual business activities and executions. It'll be even more fantastic, quantity of information is one thing, but the quality of information is also another. Too much information cannot be processed with limited resources in one company. So, the magnitude of importance, how salient this is for the company's key decision-making, say, ongoing capital allocation. Ioannis mentioned about, remuneration policies, but all these key decision-making, that is extremely adding the values to the companies.
Great, thank you, Yoko. and thinking about this journey that we're all on, right? The evolution, you know, Yoko, you rightfully noted that a lot of teams that own these processes internally were sort of siloed sustainability or ESG teams. And Ioannis, you mentioned that a lot of these issues were contained within glossy sustainability reports, but we're seeing a transition now. We're seeing demands from investors as well as regulators that this information is communicated consistently in not just sustainability reports, but financial reports and even regulatory filings. You know, we're seeing now in the US greater disclosure requirements for human capital management type issues, for instance. So thinking about the journey that we're on and the acceleration that's taking place, and to your point, Yoko, the need for companies to monitor how these issues are evolving across the external risk landscape. What do you see as the future for corporate strategy when it comes to taking more ownership of these ESG issues? And who do you think is really going to spearhead that within the company?
It's a very good question. Ultimately, sustainability is a matter, you know, also should resonate with everybody inside the company. But, you know, for the entire company to be sort of sharing that common ground, it is very important that the top leadership really leads this process, owns it publicly, and then also, you know, talk about it, you know, communicates internally and externally. I think it's absolutely important.
Yeah, and to your point, you know, investor relations, the office of the CFO, the CEO, the board of directors, you know, absolutely seeing much more emphasis that these issues are being overseen from those capacities.
Yes, and also, if I may, you know, clear ownership, leadership, you know, indicated at the top level, and then translated into, you know, business strategies. So cascade it down to the business areas. You know, I take an example of car company. I used to work for the car company for many, many years. Now, owned it, then that will be translated into, you know, product strategy. It will be translated into, you know, marketing strategy, production strategy, you know, planning, you know, what lineup of the technology, what lineup the products would be then, you know, suitable. And then, of course, that would have got an important implication for the financial, you know, the accounting department, how to then allocate the resources going forward. So, you know, it's a whole, how do you say, the functions of the company needed to be brought on the board. And that way it should be working. And then, you know, it should be, you know, really making difference.
Absolutely. Real integration, right? You set the strategy, you know what your risks and opportunities are, and then it's about bringing that into the operational level of the company as well. And
yes.
Ioannis, do you have any final remarks on that before we wrap up the conversation?
Absolutely. I think the short version is that this is the challenge of our times. This is the sustainability and ESG is the major disruption of our time. So what do we know about disruptions? You either adapt or you perish and you're being replaced. And you have seen this process play over and over and over again. Look at Tesla in the automobile industry. Look at Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat in the food production industry. So I think that companies, I would dare say, you know, they don't have the luxury of choosing who will and who will not spearhead a change towards more responsible way of doing business. At this point in time, in my experience, you see definitely both approaches, and perhaps that's the golden sort of answer here, right? It's certainly a top-down approach to for the transition to have legitimacy, to have the resources required, so that everyone in the organization builds trust towards the transformation. But at the same time, like we saw in Amazon, for instance, right, and the online walkouts of employees and so on, it is also fundamentally a bottoms-up approach. So the thing that the best of companies out there are the ones that try to and are successful at capturing the zeitgeist, so to speak, by setting into motion both of these processes, the top-down and the bottom-up in sync towards that destination. And I think that's very important to understand that this is a transformation for many companies. And what companies don't understand sometimes is that this is a go, no-go decision. I will or will not be sustainable. Typically, that's not how transitions happen. Yoko also talked about the automobile industry earlier. Think about that industry, right? They have a fundamental challenge of scaling down fossil fuel cars and introducing electric, self-driven, and so on. Even traditional huge industries like oil and gas, for instance, for them, it's also a transition because they have to scale down their fossil fuel arm and hopefully start scaling up their renewables, right? So I think important as it is to understand that, you know, within organizations, the spearheading is sort of the idea of where top down meets bottoms up. It is also important to add this time dimension here. And as we know, especially for big issues, we are running out of time. So what I've seen in my experience is that transition is best managed when companies have an understanding of the science and how the science tells us that, for instance, the decarbonization paths should take place if we are to get to net zero, for instance, by 2050. So the good news is that work has been done. Science has developed those paths. We know our carbon budget. So in a sense, companies need to simply translate that into a transition plan that allows them to migrate from the old business models to the new ones. And here, by the way, and I'll finish on that, this is clearly a deeply social issue. It's not just an environmental issue. We're talking about retraining employees. We're talking about creating new jobs for which we need to match the skill set of the economy. We're talking about, that's why you see a lot of talk these days about green jobs. And even President-elect Biden, actually, his climate plan is fundamentally a jobs plan, right? So I think that transition, whether we talk about the level of the company or the level of the country or indeed globally, is what we should be focusing all of our efforts. And we can spare nobody. We need everybody on that journey if we will have a fighting chance to achieve this sustainable future that we all talk about.
Yeah. The time is now. So as a company, invest, as you said, Ioannis, earlier, invest in your people, invest in your skills, invest in resources and technologies that will help you get there in a more smart way, in a faster way. So definitely the time is now, and appreciate both of you taking your time to share your expert thoughts on this and to collaborate with Datamaran through the academic program. It's absolutely been a pleasure to see the progress there, and wish you the best of luck on your next endeavors.
Thank you so much for having us. Such a pleasant discussion, deep discussion. And let me take the opportunity to also thank Datamaran for this partnership and for giving the opportunity to these very motivated and engaged participants to go even deeper and understand even better this whole challenge of accumulating, reporting, using ESG data that are at the heart of this journey. So thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for having me. It really is an exciting time for the corporate as well as, I believe, all the stakeholders.